So, in the following Shiur, I'd like to take a small break from the topics that we've been learning here or discussing here in Kolel, and I want to go off onto another topic entirely, which may also be of interest. Before we get to the topic, I just want to introduce it by saying that when we live in this day and age, we're influenced in thousands of ways, consciously or unconsciously, by the world around us. And there are all kinds of assumptions, tiny assumptions, large assumptions that accompany us through our lives. And we don't necessarily stop and pause and ask, where does this assumption come from? And is this a recent thing? Has this been around forever? So the example we're going to discuss right now comes from the field of Chosh and Mishpat and the world of law and lawsuits. And it's the sort of basic assumption we have today that you can sue and demand compensation for emotional distress. Meaning there's no malva and leva, there's no shutfim, no mazik, no yerusha, but there are all kinds of ways that you could ruin someone's life, whether short-term or long-term. And the notion today is that you're entitled to demand compensation if someone caused that. The question, therefore, is where does this assumption come from? When did it emerge? And is there any such concept in halacha? If you'd like to know how I got to this question, so it did come up due to Ma'aseh Shahaya, something that came to my attention. Can't really share any of the details, of course, but very, very broadly, someone or some people did a certain avla to someone else, whatever it was, and then after a while, there were those timing that essentially destroyed his life, from the inside, totally, long term. So it's kaviyachol these people's fault. Now, there is such a possibility. We know just the distress can cause a person to have severe reaction, whether mentally or even physically. So the question is there any claim here? Is there any argument to be made? Any suit, al pitaira, beyond whatever the original issue was? So when I looked into it a little bit, I didn't find any I didn't seem to find anything directly addressing this in such an extreme way. Doesn't mean there isn't, and if anybody is aware of anything or finds anything, I'll be happy to know, happy to hear. But the closest topic that I found was the general, broad discussion that there is today about this concept of emotional distress. And when we see how we deal with that, we'll, Mamela, also understand how we deal with the bigger questions. Now before we go forward, I'll note there is a very somewhat related concept, which is suing for defamation. So in defamation, libel, it's also a bit of an abstract nezek, but it could have very, very real consequences. So in that sense, it's similar. But on the other hand, it's in its own category, and as we shall see, it's been around for the concept. Recognizing that type of damage is really in a bit of its own category. Now, the first thing in halacha you might think of when you hear this question is, what about baishas? Isn't there a concept of baishas? So when you mazik someone, pay them dmei baishas. Seems like you're paying for some kind of internal, emotional reaction. A person feels embarrassed. It's a feeling. But as we shall see, this is not simple at all. But at any rate, we're going to try to focus mostly on the more abstract situations, especially if sometimes there isn't even any shame per se. It's not necessarily that everyone's walking around and shaming someone in the street, or it feels like people are talking behind their back. Someone can have an adverse reaction to something, to an avla, that's fully inside their own head as well. So it could be, as when we speak about emotional distress, it could be even beyond really the category of baishas anyway. But where does this idea come from? So now, this is not law school. We're not here to learn Goyish law, but I think it is a little helpful to get an idea of these concepts and where they come from. So I'll just quote a bit from what you can find easily online. So there's two categories in English law, American law. There's intentional infliction of emotional distress, meaning you did it b'kavana, you wanted them to have an adverse reaction. So this concept in law, in common law means that sort of the judges made it up as they went along. No one ever passed such a law, but it is part of common law of tort, where you can sue for being hurt. So you're able to recover for severe emotional distress caused by another individual who intentionally or recklessly inflicted emotional distress by behaving in a, quote, extreme and outrageous way. This concept was introduced because at some point you start realizing that if you only are judging for actual assault, so you'll have a lot of situations that aren't covered by actual assault. What are you going to do then? This idea started being discussed, according to this, in England in the late 1800s. So, a quote from the 1860s, as saying mental pain, in some decision handed down in 1861, mental pain or anxiety the law cannot value and does not pretend to redress when the all-lawful act causes that alone. Though where a material damage occurs and is connected with it, it is impossible a jury, in estimating it, should altogether overlook the feelings of the party interested. Meaning, if there's a nezek gufni, then part of the nezek includes also how it felt. It's hard to separate the two things. But if it's just a nezek nafshi, just an emotional thing, so as late as 1861, they were still saying that's not something the court has anything to say about. Right? So you can prank someone, you can shock them very severely, you can have full intention of trying to hurt them, but if it's just shock without impact, it's just words and feelings and reactions, so that was barred. Then, somewhere around the 1880s, the 1890s, there was this shift, a case of someone who ran a railroad with negligence, so that had some kind of negative impact on the people on the railroad. So the question was, are they chayiv or not? So they started creating this concept. They started broadening this concept. And there was this big case where someone decided to prank a woman. He came and told the woman that her husband was in a terrible accident, and she reacted just physically and emotionally and in a very, very extreme way. Mamish seemed to ruin her life. And this is in 1897, they officially accepted and declared that they're being mechayev for intentional infliction of mental shock. And that's where the idea picked up from. The second category is negligent infliction of emotional distress, where you're still behaving negligently, you're not taking whatever it is seriously, you had no intention, you had no machshava about the other person's feelings. Maybe that's the problem. You should have been thinking about their feelings, but it's not like you're out to hurt them in any way. And when you look this up, right in the first sentence, it's a controversial, area of law, due to mainly the issue of ein ladavar soif. And apparently, this concept arose as late as the 1960s. Courts in America in the 1960s started slowly accepting this as a complaint as well. In one case, it was the person sued due to negligence, let's say in a factory or whatever it was. He witnessed the death of a relative from a distance. So he wasn't actually in the zone of danger. He was not at any threat from this calamity, but he was close enough that he witnessed it, and just witnessing it caused him emotional harm. So, Supreme Court of California, 1968, this is the big case where they said, oh, you know what, we're going to be mechayev nizak. And then 2 years later, they went to another court in another state, went even further and said that if you negligently cause flood damage to someone's home, so there's the emotional distress caused by that is also a basis for suing. So it's literally as late as the 1960s and the 1970s here in America. You can look up in Israel. Similarly, it's called nezek bilti mamoni tahar. You can see how it developed in Israel as well. Of course, there are many different categories and subcategories here. We're not getting into all the legal minutia, how you brought about the harm. Did it accompany any actual physical harm or damage, or totally not? But as we've seen, this concept, certainly in its most abstract form, or when it's totally unintentional, is a very, very, very recent concept, and you have to look at it accordingly. Even if by today, it's almost become an obvious thing. The first thing a person thinks when someone ba'avlas them is, people that are litigious, can I sue them for emotional distress? So I saw someone who's mitzayin to a tshuva by the Shiur Lameshiv, famous Rav of Yosef Shaul Nottenson of Lemberg, very famous for his tshuvas, who discusses the concept of baishas and halacha and seems to come up with a broader definition. And we'll go through the tshuva, and that will be our way of familiarizing ourselves with where halacha stands on this inyan. So if you look in Shiur Lameshiv, Madura Tinyana Chelek Daled Siman Samach Tes. So he has an interesting, starts with an interesting sichsuch and cheshin mishpat. Be interesting to share, but I don't think we have the time for it. After he finishes discussing that, he says the question touched on asmachta, right? So asmachta is you are mischayev for something, you commit, but it's not a fair commitment. You're not really getting something necessarily worthwhile in exchange. And there's a good chance that you're hoping, at least, that you're not going to lose the money, right? So the classic case, of course, is gambling. Game's a chance. So if you lose the money, it doesn't really seem fair that you lost the money. What was it in exchange for? But the reason why you agreed is because you thought you had a chance of winning. Once you lose, the argument is that if you would have known that you were going to lose, you never would have gone into it to begin with. So you weren't fully committed, you didn't fully agree, and that's the issue of asmachta. So the Shiur Lameshiv, seemingly when he printed the tshuvas, he says, once I'm speaking about asmachta, so I'll mention a different story. He says, someone made kishrei chitun, a shidduch with a woman, and there was they were waiting for some kind of financial development, seemingly that she had to raise a certain sum to be the nadin, up until a certain point. And they made their own agreement. As we'll see later, there's a concept of knas and shidduchim, but this sounds like it was their own agreement that if she doesn't get the money by a certain time, she's not canceling the shidduch, she just doesn't get the money up until a certain time, then both of them gave money to a third party. If she doesn't get the money by a certain time, he collects his money and her money that she deposited. And she didn't make it, she didn't get the nedunya that had been discussed. So the question is there some kind of asmachta here, right? She agreed to lose the money, but it was only on the assumption that she was going to make it in time. So is there an issue of asmachta here? So he says this is, of course, very much related to the concept of knas and shidduchim, which is a much older concept. So if you look in Shulchan Aruch, Siman Reish Zayin, and Chesha Mishpat, Reish Zayin, Sifta Zayin. So it says there, the Mechaber writes, when Chachmei Sfarad wanted to get around the asmachta, they had a certain legal trick that they would do to get around it. And the Mechaber says they did that for Kol HaTnoim Shebein Adam L'Ishtei B'Shidduchim. And then the Mechaber adds, Yeshayimrim, you don't have to do that whole shtick, because the knas for someone who backs out in the shidduch is not an asmachta. Because there's also an element of busha here. It's not just, you didn't meet your obligation. By breaking off the shidduch, it's always shameful for the other party. So that somehow gets rid of the asmachta issue. The Ramah adds, that that's what they did in Ashkenaz. They just made a knas, they didn't do any fiction, any tricks around it. But you do need a kinyan. Right? One thing we do till today is a kinyan. As Derech Agav, we're mentioning this, so the source to look up on this is Sefer Tnoim, Vart Edison V'Nisum, Araber 11. goes through the inyanim and the history. Bottom line, he writes in the beginning that it seems that around the time of the Alter Rebbe and his Talmidim, they stopped mentioning the Chedem. They used to write a Chedem in the Tanoim. And by the time of the Tzemach Tzedek, they stopped mentioning the Knas. Up until then, for hundreds of years, it was a Knas, and by the time of the Tzemach Tzedek, you see the Knas starts disappearing. Right? So all we have left is the Kinyan and the Shtara Tanoim itself we write before the Chasana. The whole interesting history as to how those things originated and what's left of them today. But rewinding back to the time of the Ramah, they were doing a Kinyan, they were writing a Knas, they were writing the Tznoim by the Shidduch. So the Ramah says, you need a Kinyan. So Shalom Eshim says, if you look in the Shach there and elsewhere says, no, you don't need a Kinyan. So he says that there's a K'tzais, Taka there in Siman Eish Zayin, who disagrees with the Shach. The K'tzais says as follows. Let's take a look at the K'tzais itself. He says, if the Baishas by a Shidduch was real Baishas, that would be one thing. Then maybe we could discuss that there's no need for a Kinyan, because Baishas, Ba'atzem, you're Mechuyev, it's a Din Baishas. But he says, Vadai, there's no Din Baishas Gomer by Shidduchin. Because Baishas, as halacha defines it, is you're only chayav at shiyasa ma'isa begufa. You have to literally go over to someone and slap them on the face, something very physical, bodily, direct. So like it says in Gemara, you look in a chayvel, it says if you spit, so you're chayav if the spit goes on the person, but if the spit hits the clothing, you're already pater. The Gemara says, why is that any less than being mevayish b'dvarim? So the Gemara says, yeah, nachanami, if you're mevayish b'dvarim, you're also pater. So you see from this Gemara that it has to be an extremely close-up physical act in order for the din baishas to apply. Mevayish b'dvarim is pater. This is brought in Shulchan Aruch, in Choshen Mishpat, Siman Tav Chaf. It says, the Ksei says, there's a Rosh in Bava Kama there. Well, let's take a look at the Rosh. The Rosh says, first of all, what's the reason? The Torah says, V'echzikav and mevushav. So that sounds like a very, very bodily, direct busha. So we see from here that the Torah chapped on Azar case, pretty extreme. That gives you a sense and a flavor for what kind of baishas we're talking about. But baishas dvarim or rakak al bigda is pater. He says, if Shira Gain wrote, even for baishas dvarim, there's a nidui, there's severe consequences. And he says, Mistaber, the Rosh says, Mistaber, that maybe baishas b'dvarim is even worse than baishas shel Kabbalah. The ein davar gadol koloshin hara, b'diba she'adam meitzia al chaverei. So here you actually see an example of libel, and you see it of Shira Gain, and in the Rosh, you see that they're taking it very differently and very seriously. And that seems to be universal. Lahavdil as well. So it says, it sounds like the Rosh is saying that baishas b'dvarim is worse, it's more intense, it could be more embarrassing. He says, no, look at the context there. The whole context is that it's a takana and a siag and a knas. It's not a real din baishas. The Rosh is just hyping up the concept, so you should take it seriously, but doesn't kommt nicht zu to the real din baishas in Torah. And there's a takana. That takana also doesn't apply here because that takana was for bali halashon. You have to literally defame someone. We're not talking about defamation. Here we're talking about a few levels removed from that. So there's no din baishas, there's no takana. So the Tosfos already, this vart of introducing baishas to the knas of a shidduch comes from Tosfos and Paiskim. So the Tosfos says, no, it's a combination of things. You have the kinyan, but the problem with the kinyan is that it's an asmachta, because they assume that the shidduch would go forward. So to sidestep the issue of the asmachta, you just need epis or something. So the baishas, not a real din baishas, it's just baishas is being added to the kinyan to strengthen the kinyan against the asmachta. That's how all of these concepts come together in the knas of a shidduch. There's a maharik who writes on a tshuva in some similar case that even if you don't do a knas, karavu be'enai d'chayev l'shalim d'mei baishas. So it sounds like the maharik did hold that there is a din baishas in these types of situations. He says, the maharik is not clear, and kvarka savnu that there's vaday ein by mishum baishas medina, unless it's a direct physical act. So that was all the k'tzais on this Shulchan Aruch and Shach. And now the Shalom Meshav comes and reacts in response to the k'tzais. He says, in my opinion, this is wrong. You said in the Gemara, it says that even if you spit on the clothing, you're potter. He says, Lefini is daiti, that's referring to baishas, that's a bodily and physical baishas. You spit at someone, you were trying to hit them, you missed, you hit the baguette. So if you fell short of your aim, of your goal, of the physical type of baishas, so then you're potter. He says, however, in Shidduchim, this is how he writes it, the baishas magia lehanefesh hasichli. That the whole baishas takes place in your mind. It's an emotional, mental process taking place. That's where the whole situation is unfolding. He says, that's even worse than hizik begufay. That's even worse than bodily harm. So b'zay pshita, it's a whole different category that even if you didn't do ma'aseh begufay, you're avad chayev. Then he quotes an interesting thing. He says, Shalu l'chacham. They asked the wise man, Ma'u ha'baishas. Amar lahem ha'seichel. V'shalu ma'u ha'seichel. V'amar lahem ha'baishas. This comes, the first makar for this is in an interesting sefer called Sefer Tikkun Midas HaNefesh by Shlem Ibn Gabirol from early time of the Rishonim in Spain, very early on, wrote Piyutim, philosophy, Musar. It was a work written in Arabic. It was translated then by Ibn Tibbon, and there are, of course, newer editions and translations today. So he has a perek on these midas of baishas, and he starts off by saying, they asked the wise man, what is intelligence? And he said, shame. And they asked him, what is shame? And he said, intelligence. In other words, they're two sides of the same coin. Interestingly, in the more modern, more recent translations, they don't translate that word from Arabic, whatever it is, as baishas, but that's a slightly different thing. It would also be interesting to know if it's a shol l'chacham. It sounds like he's taking it from an earlier, or maybe not Jewish source, but didn't get to the bottom of that. From there, it's quoted by the Rashbatz in his Pirush Magen Avos on Pirkei Avos. So what do you see from this pisgam, from the chacham? That self-consciousness, self-awareness, a person feels shame. That's synonymous with being a developed intellectual being. That's part of our hallmark as humans, essentially. Animals don't feel shame. Human beings feel shame. The whole kav in that perek and tikkun midas hanefesh is that shame is a very, very rudimentary, basic function that helps a human act as a human. Humans are motivated by shame, and it's important to keep that in mind. The person should be aware that I don't want to be ashamed, and therefore I should calculate my behavior accordingly. So that's in that context, it's like a self-help context, so to speak. But he's plucking it from there. Even in Pirkei Avos, I think the Magen Avos quotes it in the context of Beishas Panim L'Gan Eden. I think it's referring to how you behave to other people. At least the Shalom Meshav is taking it and applying it to how you deal with other people. He's saying that that's what we are as humans. We feel shame, and that's where we're trying to achieve and attain that self-awareness. Then he's mitzayin to an interesting tshuva, and where he got those lines from. Chutam Meshulash of the Tashbates, the Rashbat. So there's a section at the end called Chutam Meshulash with tshuvas from other Rabbanim. There's a section there with tshuvas by a Rav by the name of Bavram Ibn Tawa in Algiers. I don't have time to get into it. A very interesting story. A bacher, he gives the kid's name, was Mefata, the neighbor's daughter. Agan Tzara, this guy was already engaged to someone else's daughter. They came up with a whole arrangement that he'll marry the victim, the chulu, but he was already engaged, and meanwhile the father of the daughter who was engaged to at this point didn't want to go ahead with that anyway. A lot of drama. Ultimately, he wrote a get. Wasn't fully clear if he wanted to write the get, if this or that. There were maidos that he can't be chayzer boy when they made the shidduch. A little complicated. And then at some point, when that other person's daughter, who got the get, then got engaged, then the bacher started screaming that he never meant it, and he still wants to marry her. And of course, he denies all the allegations about him. A big mess. A lot of drama, as we said. So at some point, it came down to, was the get a good get, was it not? So he uses this yisoid. He says that b'chlal, when you attach money to a get, it helps you sidestep all the maidos, all the statements that you made that said that I don't mean it, it's not for real. Once you attach a financial gain to it, you say, oh, in exchange for the financial gain, he was mevat all the maidos, the get was real. So he says, in this case, part of the deal for writing the get was that they came up with this whole arrangement to help this kid save face. That they should write a document that the reason why she's getting divorced is not because she suspects him and not because they don't want to marry him anymore and they're not accusing him of any allegations. And he writes that he only is just purely of his own volition that he decided he wants to marry someone else. It was very important to them to save face. And in this context, the Bavram Ibn Tawa says that there's nothing like saving face, there's nothing like saving yourself from shame. Especially if you have ma'at havchana, a little self-awareness. Then he quotes, oh, l'chacham, and all those l'shoyness, that a human by definition wants to avoid anything that can shame him in this way. Goes through, B'mari Chazal, about the chomer, being mavayish a person, it all comes together to make this case that saving face is a very powerful thing. So in that case, he said, Rebazoi, that means that the get was a good get, because instead of getting money, he got something even better. He got this whole deal to save face. So there, the context is boishus from something like that. Here we're just talking back to the Shir Lamesha, we're just talking about the boishus, no one's accusing anybody, no one's alleging anything, it's just a shidduch that didn't work out. But that's how far the Shir Lamesha wants to expand this concept. He says, there's a pagam lahanefesh, how a person feels about it. Even though you never did anything to the person. So you see clearly from Chazal, this same argument. Someone is very, very chomer. So that is powerful enough. He disagrees with the K'tzais. The K'tzais said Baishus is like a fake Baishus that bolsters the Kinyan, that has the Asmachta. According to the Shir Lamesha, who's agreeing with the Shach, he's saying you don't need a Kinyan because the Baishus is real, and because the Baishus is real, it gets rid of the Kinyan issue, the Asmachta issue, it's all out of the picture. He says, there's also for emperors, there's a Shut Avedis HaGershuni that asks in a similar type of question, like isn't there, even if you break a shidduch, you don't break a shidduch in order to shame someone, in order to embarrass someone. It's a byproduct. He talks about a case where they wanted to break a shidduch and the boy was screaming that everyone's going to look at me funny, it's going to really shame me and disgrace me. And the Vayda Sagarshuni was taking his side. He says, what about the fact that they're not here to do it on purpose? And l'chayra, the whole point is that it's intentional. But he says, no, he discusses it there. He says, in his opinion, even according to Chazal, in this type of case, this is a discussion. So the Shir Lamesha says, we can sidestep the whole back and forth with my yisoid. If my yisoid is that it's mevayish the nefesh, and we take that very seriously, as a very, very severe thing, then avada, even if leiniskav and levayish, Masha'enkein, the Gemara is talking about beguf. If you slap someone in the face by accident, the whole gather is that you're trying to hit them on purpose. But when you hurt someone, when you bruise someone emotionally, there it doesn't matter what your intention was. That's what he wants to say. So, therefore, in this case, he's very much taking the side of the man, that where the woman didn't gather in the dunya in time, takes his side. Finds a few more makaitis. We don't have time to get into all of that, so we're going to have to cut it a bit short. So what we see here from this whole discussion, like I said, is we see the basic halachic gather of Baishas, plus the Shir Lamesha, who is trying to expand it a lot further to seemingly include all kinds of emotional bruising and damaging. But Dafka, in the source where I came across this, which is a kunchas, seems to be like a Mizrahi Rabbanim type of organization in Eretz Yisrael. They put out a kunchas on Ma'amarim b'sugyat din boshet v'lashon hara b'zman hazeh. Online, WhatsApp, websites, defamation. What does the halacha have to say about it? It's a whole interesting kunchas. But in the middle, one of them, Yedidya Levi, writes about this general question. What does halacha have to say about pitzui al grimat agmat nefesh? And he says, of course we know about boishes, but it doesn't apply in the types of cases we're talking about. And b'chlal, boishes is not even one of the things that Beis Din is done bizman hazeh. And therefore, the reality is that Beis Din almost never deals with claims of agmas nefesh. He's trying to make the case, though, that maybe there are some exceptions. Then he brings the Shiur L'Meishiv, and he himself says, Omnam, halacha is not paskin like the Shiur L'Meishiv, and look around. Batei Din are not requiring people to pay for agmas nefesh. And Shidduchim is its own special category, the knas, whatever that is. And if you're interested in the topic, I recommend looking there further. And defamation in particular, there's a lot more been written about that in the last couple of years. And from looking around, I almost did not see anybody quoting the Shiur L'Meishiv, so it doesn't seem to have been particularly influential, like he said, la halacha. And b'chlal, if you look online, different questions, and look in Svarim, different questions. When they describe Chesha Mishpat, contemporary Chesha Mishpat questions, whenever the question is, can I get pitzuyim al agmat nefesh? The answer basically is always, well, no, of course not. It's not a thing. I just want to conclude with an interesting article that I found. There's a kaivet called Mishnat Yosef, Talmidim of Avadia Yosef, from Tafshanai and Vav. There's a rabbi, his name is Rav Yosef Chai Siman Tov. So he's asking about buses in Israel. A lot of agmas nefesh people get from buses in Israel. Lots of opportunities for that. So what if you're late to something important, it's their fault, or let's say they didn't pick you up and you had to pay for a taxi? These types of questions. So first he establishes that direct damage like that, relatively direct damage like that, they're avada pater from. It's a grama, it's too indirect for hilchos nezakim. The question is, what about this agmat nefesh? You see all kinds of examples, whether you're being squeezed in the bus or whether they skip the stop. I don't know how you can complain about both things, but and he says, I realized that benigud la'arkaot, the non-Torah, I can't say not Jewish because it's Israel, but non-Torah courts charge, exorbitant amounts. They require exorbitant amounts for emotional distress, and in Batei Din there's nothing, right? Because there's no such thing in halacha. What about baishas? Baishas has to be very physical, very bodily. What about tsars? Tsar is also on the list. No, tsar is also tsar begufay, not tsar halev. So he's trying to argue, it's interesting to see how he's writing. Maybe we can come up with some kind of basis. Maybe we could introduce the category of agmat nefesh into halacha. Maybe dinah d'malchus dinah, that's a whole pilpul. Does dinah d'malchus dinah apply to the state of Israel? And does it apply to things that are not tax related? The government doesn't have a vested interest here. What about minig ha-medina? If everyone sort of accepts that this is something you're required for, maybe we could say it's minig ha-medina. But you can't say it's minig ha-medina because halacha says you're not chayiv, so you can have a minig against halacha. But what's the explanation? Why taka? He says, why is it not a concept in Torah? So he says, if you look, it says in Gemara Baba Kama that if you hit someone directly on the ear and they become deaf, it's mamash nezek amum. But if you blow a loud sound near their ear, and even if it causes deafness, garnished. What's the reason? What's the explanation? Because we say that you didn't do anything. Whatever happened to him, it's like his fault. He shouldn't have gotten shocked. He shouldn't have gotten taken aback. So with this Yesod, he says, this is the big Yesod according to halacha. Whatever happens to you, it's up to you to respond with equilibrium. You have to figure out how to handle things, fastballs that life sends your way. And if Lamaisa, that's not what happened, then according to halacha, according to Torah, that's all in your head. And it's very sad, very unfortunate, very sympathetic. But, all these mamarim, all these memras, they all stand to bolster this concept. He says, so you see some examples, related examples of this in more recent shuvas. Someone really is very desirous of a certain object. Right? We know in halach, if someone's desirous of a woman, we say, let him die, we don't care. But here, he's desirous of an object. So they asked Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and Salmas Chaim. The doctors say his health he's going to lose his health. It's driving him crazy. He said, oh, it's his problem. Why should we help him? Let him get over it. He says more recently, Yitzchak Zilberstein, Chashuke Chamed. There's a Yerusha, a fight over Yerusha. One guy won the family heirloom menorah, but the other guy, they say his mom is going to become so sick. The doctors say, he brought a note from the doctor saying we'll kill him. No, you have a problem. Get over it. Figure out how to get over it. Again, why should we cooperate with that? So based on this, he says that's Taka the Hezber al Pitaira. Why, in fact, as a rule, maybe there's some exceptions here and there, and I recommend those interested can always look into more Makairis, but as a rule, his conclusion is that, back to his question about the bus company, the bus company is not responsible for any emotional distress caused by the way they run their business.